There's a question that's been building across WNBA media for weeks now, and it keeps getting louder. Is Sophie Cunningham becoming a problem for Caitlin Clark? It sounds like a strange question at first. Cunningham isn't a star in the traditional sense. She's a role player with a modest scoring average. But she's become one of the most talked about people in the league, for reasons that go well beyond basketball. A team co-owner has been suspended over a confrontation connected to this story. A head coach wore a t-shirt about it during a nationally watched game. A political advocacy group has publicly called on the league to change its rules because of it. And underneath all of it is a detail most of the loudest voices skip entirely. The WNBA doesn't actually have a written policy on this question at all. So today we're doing the full breakdown, not a hot take, not a verdict, but the actual documented timeline. What Cunningham said. What the league's rules actually say, on paper, right now. How coaches, a co-owner, and national media all got pulled into it. And, importantly, what Caitlin Clark herself has actually said when asked directly. Because that part of the story has been reported inconsistently, and we're going to get it right. The Protector. To understand why Sophie Cunningham has this much pull on the conversation, you have to go back to how she first entered it, and it has nothing to do with any of this. When Caitlin Clark faced some of the more physical defensive attention of her rookie year, Cunningham was one of the first teammates fans saw stepping in to defend her. That moment mattered. It gave a lot of fever fans, especially newer ones who'd come to the league specifically because of Clark, someone on the roster who felt like she had Clark's back in real time, on the court, when it counted. That single dynamic, teammate as protector, did a lot for Cunningham's popularity almost overnight. Her following grew fast. Fans who wanted an enforcer on the roster embraced her specifically because of that willingness to step into physical, uncomfortable moments and absorb some of the heat aimed at Clark. It's worth noting this is a familiar sports dynamic, not a unique one. Star players in physical sports often have a teammate who becomes known as their protector, someone whose value to the fanbase isn't fully captured by a box score. That's basically what was happening with Cunningham, at least at first, before any of this other conversation existed. It's worth sitting on that origin point for a second, because it explains something important about why this later controversy landed the way it did. Cunningham didn't build her platform through a culture war statement. She built it through a basketball moment, loyalty, physicality, showing up for a teammate. That's the foundation everything else got layered on top of, and it's part of why her later comments carried more weight with her existing fanbase than a similar comment from an unknown player might have. From role player to celebrity. Since then, Cunningham's profile has grown well past the player who defends Caitlin Clark. She's appeared in national commercials, signed with major brands, and had her own signature Adidas release that generated real buzz, a level of off-court attention that's unusual for a player with her statistical role on the floor. That's not a knock on her. Plenty of athletes across plenty of sports build outsized off-court profiles through personality, timing, and visibility rather than pure production. The WNBA's broader growth over the past 2 seasons has created exactly the kind of media environment where a player with the right mix of charisma and willingness to speak candidly can become a genuine celebrity, independent of all-star selections or scoring titles. That platform matters for understanding what came next. When a role player with limited national name recognition says something about a hot-button topic, it might get a few hours of attention in niche sports media before disappearing. When a recognizable, commercially visible personality with a built-in, engaged fanbase says the same thing, it moves differently, faster, wider, and into media spaces that don't normally cover the WNBA at all. That's a big part of why this particular story had the reach it did. It's also worth noting how quickly the reverse can happen too. A player can go from admired role player to lightning rod within the span of a single news cycle, simply because the platform that made her likable in one context, loyalty, toughness, standing up for a teammate, turned out to also be the platform other people used to project political meaning onto her, whether or not she intended that. The comments that started it. The bigger conversation started when Cunningham was asked, in an interview, about transgender athletes competing in women's sports. She said she believes biological differences should be a factor in how that competition question gets decided. That's the actual claim, stated plainly. It's worth being precise here, because a lot of what's circulated since has either softened or sharpened what she actually said, depending on which side is doing the retelling. This is genuinely one of the most contested topics in sports right now, and it didn't start with Cunningham or with the WNBA. Versions of this same debate have played out in track and field, swimming, cycling, and college athletics for years, including high-profile cases involving athletes with naturally elevated testosterone levels who were required to undergo hormone therapy to compete in women's categories at the international level, well before this became a mainstream American sports conversation. The WNBA moment is a new chapter of a much older, ongoing debate, not something that appeared out of nowhere. So let's lay out where the actual disagreement sits, because understanding it is more useful than picking a side and repeating it louder. One position, the one Cunningham expressed, is built around the idea that physical differences developed through male puberty, such as bone density, muscle mass, and lung capacity, can create competitive advantages that persist even after transition and hormone therapy, and that fairness in women's sports categories depends on accounting for that. People who hold this view generally frame it as protecting a competitive category, not as opposing anyone's right to transition or live as themselves. Advocacy groups on this side, including organizations like Concerned Women for America, have argued publicly that leagues need to affirmatively look in the mirror and clarify whether they stand behind a biological sex-based definition of eligibility. The opposing position argues that transgender women are women, full stop, and that excluding them from women's sports categories is itself a form of discrimination, one that, in practice, affects a very small number of athletes at the professional level while having an outsized psychological and social impact on trans people broadly, including kids who play school sports and aren't professional athletes at all. People who hold this view point out that most professional and Olympic sporting bodies that do allow transgender participation already require hormone therapy and eligibility screening, and argue that framing the debate around a hypothetical rather than an actual roster situation does more harm than good. Both sides argue they're protecting something real. One side says they're protecting girls' and women's sports as a category. The other says they're protecting a group of people from being excluded from sports altogether, often based on hypothetical scenarios rather than documented cases. That's genuinely where the disagreement lives, and it's not something this channel is going to resolve in a WNBA breakdown video, but it's a lot more useful to name the actual disagreement than to just relay whichever side is currently louder online. The policy that doesn't actually exist. Here's a detail that's gotten surprisingly little attention relative to how much this story has dominated WNBA media. The league does not have a written transgender athlete eligibility policy. The WNBA's 2026 collective bargaining agreement contains one relevant line. It states, in the league's own contractual language, that only players who are women are eligible to play in the WNBA. That's it. There's no further definition of what that means in practice, no hormone therapy standard, no medical eligibility criteria, nothing that spells out how the league would actually handle a transgender player's eligibility if the question ever came up directly. Multiple outlets that have requested clarification from the league on this point have not received one. That absence of a defined policy is a big part of why this entire conversation has generated so much heat relative to how little it's actually about an existing roster situation. As of now, there is no publicly known transgender woman who has played in the WNBA. The league has had openly non-binary players, most notably Lashia Clarendon, who also underwent gender-affirming top surgery while playing, but their birth sex was female, which is a legally and medically different situation from the one at the center of this debate. So this is, at the moment, a policy debate about a hypothetical, layered on top of a much broader, ongoing legal and political shift. In February 2025, a presidential executive order aimed at restricting transgender participation in women's sports led to a number of governing bodies revisiting their own rules, including the NCAA updating its policy shortly after. In March 2026, the International Olympic Committee adopted a new eligibility framework requiring athletes to screen negative for a specific gene associated with male sex development in order to compete in the women's category at the Olympics, a meaningfully stricter standard than the sport-by-sport approach the IOC had used previously. And in 2026, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in a case involving a West Virginia school policy, allowing schools to exclude transgender athletes from girls' teams based on biological sex. Separately, by this point 27 states, including Indiana, had passed their own legislation restricting transgender participation in girls' and women's school and collegiate sports. None of that legal and political landscape is unique to the WNBA. It's the backdrop the WNBA conversation is happening inside of. But it does mean the pressure on the league to clarify its own position isn't coming only from one outspoken player's comments. It's part of a much larger wave moving through American sports at every level, from youth leagues up through the Olympics. How coaches responded. Cunningham's comments didn't stay contained to one interview. They set off a wider reaction across the league, starting with other coaches and players choosing to respond publicly. Minnesota Lynx head coach Cheryl Reeve wore a shirt reading, "Trans Kids Belong," during a nationally broadcast game against the Fever, a visible, deliberate statement of where she stands, made in the highest visibility setting available to her, given how much attention Fever games draw with Clark on the floor. Golden State Valkyries coach Natalie Nakase also spoke publicly in support of transgender inclusion around the same period. There's also a smaller, less covered detail worth including. Before that Lynx-Fever matchup, Reeve and Cunningham were seen having a direct conversation on the sideline prior to tip-off. There's no public reporting on exactly what was said between them, and it would be speculation to fill that in, but the fact that the two spoke directly, rather than only through media statements, is worth noting as a more human detail in a story that's mostly played out through press conferences and social media. The reaction to Reeve's shirt split in a predictable but important way. Some praised her for using her platform and position to make a visible statement of support for a group she felt was being unfairly targeted. Others argued that inserting a politically charged statement into a nationally watched broadcast, specifically timed to a Fever game, was a questionable choice regardless of the underlying position, that it used a moment meant to showcase competition to make a statement that a large portion of the audience hadn't tuned in for. Both of those are opinions about tactics and appropriateness, not factual disputes, and reasonable people land differently on which one is more persuasive. Commentator Katie Nolan pushed back on Cunningham's framing more directly, arguing that "protect girls' sports" language can sound like common sense on the surface while glossing over a more complicated reality underneath, essentially, that the simple version of the argument obscures how legally and medically complicated the actual question is. That's a substantive critique worth including on its own terms, not just a talking point to wave away. The Seattle incident. The story escalated further with an incident involving Seattle Storm co-owner Celeste Keaton. At a Storm-Fever game, two young fans in the crowd were holding a sign supporting Cunningham's position and wearing shirts referencing chromosomal terminology tied to the broader biological sex argument. According to reporting on the incident, Keaton cursed at the two girls. The league fined and suspended Keaton for 5 games over the confrontation. That part is a matter of record. The league took disciplinary action against her for her conduct toward fans, regardless of the underlying topic that prompted the exchange. What's disputed is the framing around it. Advocacy groups aligned with Cunningham's position seized on the incident as proof that young fans expressing a mainstream opinion were being met with hostility by people in positions of power within the league, and argued the punishment didn't go far enough given who was involved. Others pointed out that a team co-owner cursing at children, whatever the provocation, is a serious lapse in conduct on its own terms, separate from anyone's view on the underlying policy debate, and that the league's decision to fine and suspend her reflects that the conduct itself, not the topic, was the problem. Both of those readings can be true at once. The league treated the co-owner's conduct as a real disciplinary matter, and the incident also became fuel for the broader political argument happening around Cunningham. That's fairly typical of how a story like this compounds. A single confrontation becomes a talking point for multiple different arguments simultaneously, each side using it to support a position it already held going in. The media and political firestorm. From there, the story moved fully into national sports media, well past WNBA-specific coverage. Bomani Jones raised the question of whether Cunningham had become a distraction for Clark. Stephen A. Smith weighed in critically on Cheryl Reeve's decision to wear the shirt during a Fever broadcast specifically. Both are examples of how a story that started as one player answering one interview question turned into a cross-platform media event, discussed on shows that don't otherwise cover the WNBA at all. The political dimension escalated too. Concerned Women for America, a conservative advocacy organization, publicly called on the WNBA to adopt an explicit biological sex-only eligibility policy, with its president arguing the league needed to decide whether it stands for what she called biological males stealing their opportunities from women athletes, a claim made about the broader debate, not about any specific WNBA player, since, again, no transgender woman is currently on a WNBA roster. Separately, a member of Congress has pushed a proposal that would tie certain tax benefits for women's sports franchises to whether they explicitly prohibit transgender participation. It's worth pointing out how this pattern usually works with stories like this one. A comment gets made in one interview, it gets amplified far past its original context, and within days the conversation is less about the original statement and more about which media figures and political organizations are willing to take the loudest, most visible position on it. That's not unique to this story specifically. It's just how the current media and political ecosystem tends to process anything touching a hot-button cultural issue, especially once elected officials and national advocacy groups get involved. What Caitlin Clark actually said. This is the part of the story that's been reported inconsistently, so let's be precise about it, because it matters. Clark was in fact asked directly about the transgender athletes in sports debate after a Fever loss to the Lynx. Her answer was brief and notably declined to take a side on the underlying policy question. She said, in substance, that this isn't really a topic discussed in the Fever locker room, and that it's not really a discussion we have in our locker room, going on to say that she views it as a matter for leagues and governing bodies to work through with athletes, and that her own focus stays on basketball. That's a meaningfully different picture than Clark has stayed completely silent. She was asked, and she answered. She just answered in a deliberately neutral way that redirected the question toward the institutions responsible for setting policy rather than offering her own opinion on the underlying debate. That's a common and, frankly, pretty savvy approach for an athlete whose brand depends on broad, mainstream appeal. Taking a visible position on one of the most polarizing topics in American culture right now carries real risk for someone in Clark's position, regardless of which side she might personally lean toward, and her answer reads like a deliberate choice to keep the focus on her sport rather than let it become part of her public identity. There's no reporting indicating Clark has been pressured by the team or the league to comment further, and no indication of tension between her and Cunningham over the issue. What we actually have is one teammate who spoke at length and became a lightning rod for it, and one teammate who was asked directly, gave a short, carefully neutral answer, and moved on. What happens next? So, pulling all of this together, is Sophie Cunningham a problem for Caitlin Clark? The honest answer is more nuanced than a yes or no headline can capture. On the court, there's no reporting suggesting any tension between them, or any indication the Fever locker room has been disrupted by this. Off the court, Cunningham has become a genuine lightning rod in a debate that's much bigger than basketball, and because she plays alongside the league's most visible player, some of that attention naturally spills toward Clark, even when Clark herself gives a short, deliberately neutral answer and otherwise stays out of it. The bigger structural question is really about the league, not about either player individually. The WNBA is operating with a policy vacuum on this exact question at a moment when the surrounding legal and political landscape, the Supreme Court decision, the IOC's new framework, state-level legislation, a sitting member of Congress proposing legislation tied to it, is moving fast in one direction. At some point, probably sooner rather than later, the league is likely to face real pressure to actually define its position in writing, rather than letting one contractual sentence do all the work. Until then, expect more of what we just walked through: individual players and coaches filling that vacuum with their own public positions, media figures amplifying whichever side gets the most engagement, and Caitlin Clark, for now, staying exactly where she's chosen to stay, focused on the game, and letting the governing bodies sort out the rest. We'll keep tracking how this story moves, including if the league ever does clarify an actual policy. If you want more breakdowns like this, separating the real reporting from the noise around Caitlin Clark and the Fever, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.